Thanks, Adam. Thanks for having me on your podcast. I have been following your journey as well over the years, and again, congratulations to what you have been achieving over the last now nearly 7-8 years when you kind of joined WoodSolutions for a while and went through a few other places on your career, now being with CLT Toolbox. And yeah, I still remember that podcast we did back then with Jonathan Evans about, I think it was actually International House, not Daramo House. Yeah. So one of Lend-Lease's first mass timber or engineered timber buildings here in Australia. Not the very first, was Forte, a library dog, but then followed by International House as a kind of significant building of scale again, and a different building typology. So first one was residential building, then more public building, and then actually a commercial office building. So that's goes back quite a few years. And over the years, I had the pleasure actually being involved in more or less all of the Lend-Lease CLT projects here in Australia, and had some influence on some of their buildings overseas as well. That's now kind of, was over the last 10 years. 9 of the last 10 years I have been with Lend-Lease. I left the organization more or less a year ago. I think today is the 15th of November, and exactly the 15th of November is when I started my last day at Lend-Lease and the first day at Weiss Insights. So that's another interesting milestone. But I kind of the work with Lend-Lease started way before actually I joined Lend-Lease. On Forte in Melbourne, I actually sold the timber to Lend-Lease. And not only we sold the timber, but provided engineering advice, and we trained the installer crew. And when I say we, back then it was KLH UK Limited. So we had been flying people into the UK. We took them onto our building sites back then. Out of memory, I think must have been some schools or academy buildings somewhere in Norwich. And they joined our installer crew to learn firsthand. So that's was quite a few years before I joined Lend-Lease. On the second project, the library at the docks, I didn't sell the timber to Lend-Lease. But I was involved back then as one of the directors of Timber First Limited, because that was in that time when I left KLH UK Limited, and we established a consultancy business called Timber First, and we provided services to Lend-Lease. So we kind of services in the engineering space, the engineering work. And we talk about here the structural engineering. We supported the Robert Bird Group as the lead engineer, but we supported Lend-Lease and the whole procurement and quality process. So the whole tender documentation, tender process, and then supporting Lend-Lease in the awarding the contract. And then we did the whole QA procedure overseas. Because back then Timber First was based in the UK and had a foot in Germany, so it was quite handy to do all the QA work overseas directly. So that's kind of a bit of a summary, and you have seen already there a few places I mentioned in that summary, like the UK, Germany, being close to the European market, which is part of my background, actually.
Yeah. Well, that was like planting a seed, I'd say. The Forte building, same with Library at the Dock. Who knows where Australia would be, and I guess the world would be, because they were world-leading projects at the time. And I think you had a bit to do with Stat House as well. So, dropping the seeds back then, and I know you had interesting experience even before that, which is related to mass timber. But from there to now, I like to just maybe ask an open-ended question in two ways. So, like, in what ways is it growing? And there's ways to be optimistic about. And I know, Karl-Heinz, you're very balanced in your viewpoints. You don't just give roses and daisies all the time. But like, what are some of the things we need to be really careful about in this space that can sort of risk the growth of the market?
That's a very good question. It will take us a while to work through. So maybe starting off with one thing, specifically looking at the Australian market. And we recently talked to the FWPA board, so Forest Wood Products Australia. We had a short presentation at the industry educator workshop last week. Did a short presentation at an event on Wellington Street project in Melbourne, where kind of in reflection, I said, we can be actually extremely proud here in Australia. So whilst Forte and Library at the Dock and International House have been probably kind of breaking the ice, you could describe it as such, but they have been actually catalyst projects. And very early on, we have been saying, actually importing timber, shipping timber across the oceans is kind of not very sustainable in a way. So if you've got timber resources growing locally, you may want to use these resources. But it became so obvious fairly quickly that there hasn't been any manufacturing capabilities at scale for these kind of products, and specifically talking about glue laminated timber and cross laminated timber here in Australia. This has kind of completely changed over the last few years. So we've got now, in a way, 3 CLT manufacturers. So a smaller setup in Tasmania. We've got Next Timber kind of just started up, and we have got Heinz Excellent already in full swing. Plus there's an entity overseas in New Zealand, not that far away as well. So you could say in this part of the world, we have got already 4 players in that space, which is fantastic. And this in such a short period of time. So we talk about a 10-year time window. And not to forget, it's not only about CLT, it's about the other parts like glue laminated timber, and there specifically, again, we've got a few players like Ash Timber doing hardwood glue lam. I know Caspin, Tasmania doing smaller quantities of hardwood glue lam. I know Heinz doing softwood glue lam and hardwood glue lam. It's kind of, again, great to see the kind of the local industry has picked it up and is actually providing actually an outstanding product quality, I have to say. So I've been looking around these plants. I still remember I went up to see the Heinz sawmill in Maryborough well before I joined Lendlease. I got a bit of an idea about their capabilities, and what they have been doing is really, really great for the local industry. At the same time, with the growth of kind of engineered timber or mass timber applications, you'll probably take some resources away from the traditional application, which is the standard timber frame housing market. And we understand that kind of currently into that market there's about a 40% imported product already. So it's kind of it's already a competitive and in a way a congested market. So we have to be always conscious and ask the question: how can we do more with less? And less in this case refers to actually, can we get more out of the fiber we have got to hand? So that's certainly one point. The other aspects, and I did mention that in the past as well. I saw actually, and I've been witnessing, and in a way part of it as well. The the capabilities in Australia had been really growing fast. It's not only having our supply opportunities, but it's the adoption of product in the design stage, the adoption of mass timber in the development space, predominantly driven by, I would say, the customer. Is quite significant over the last few years. It's really great to see.
That's awesome, Karl-Heinz. And so yeah, the market is obviously growing, and I know, well, I saw you do a presentation in last year a few times, the 30 years in 30 minutes, and there are some other things I remember that we're going to be careful of, maybe from a design point of view as well, and certain things we can do to make sure we're actually getting the best solution for the clients as well. So if you can talk a little bit about that would be great.
Yeah, obviously we just touched on the fiber and the resource as a material, but there is still kind of a lot of consideration, a lot of work required in actually getting certainty in the whole design and delivery process. I just this morning put together a few slides because I'm presenting at a panel later on this afternoon, and one of the final slides is actually titled kind of fail fast, learn fast is not an option. So we hear a lot about fail fast, learn fast, especially in the software space, and you're kind of directly exposed to that, and people tend to adopt that, to say, okay, well, we're on a learning journey, so let's tap into that. In the built environment, we just cannot do that. That's what I'm saying. It's not an option, because we're creating a physical asset, and that asset kind of will house people. It's kind of providing shelter for people. It's creating a workplace for people. So therefore, a failure of structures and failure of building performance in order to learn fast, as I said, it's not an option. And there's still so many things to consider. Fire is one aspect. The bigger aspect is obviously moisture and water ingress. And the more buildings being built now globally, the more you hear and see about failures of certain structures. And that's not going to be unrecognized by insurers, for example. They pick that up and say, actually, is engineered timber, mass timber, are we really certain around the long-term performance of these buildings? And from my perspective, having been involved in way over 100 buildings, and again, touch wood, I haven't had a single kind of customer or client coming back and say the building doesn't doesn't work or is leaking, etc. But you have to really kind of not tread carefully is the wrong word. I always tend to say, if you're in a hurry, go slowly, which means you take steps much more considered. And understanding building physics, for example, is such an important part. I know there's standards and codes. I kind of describe them here and there, and don't mention it to Boris. Describes so standards are always you design towards the standards a lazy approach, because it's compliance driven. You just want to make sure you comply with that certain standard, but you can be better as a standard, because a standard represents all is the smallest common denominator to ensure that actually everybody executing across the supply chain is somehow in the safe space, which doesn't exclude, if you're kind of build towards a standard, doesn't exclude failure in other areas. And one of the areas is certainly in call it the building physics space is moisture. Our initial reaction of the industry is saying, okay, if moisture is a problem, let's treat timber. My subsequent question is always, so does actually the treatment of timber solve the moisture problem in the first place? And I used that example with the New Zealand government, where actually treated timber is kind of deeply embedded in the standards and the codes. I asked the question, so why are you making treatment mandatory? The response is automatically, we've got a leaky harm problem. And if you go apply the same principles, so does treatment solve the leaky harm problem? It doesn't, but it just extends the lifespan of the product, but it doesn't solve the leak in the first place. The same is with condensation, etc. So that's certainly something where the industry still has to learn a lot. Very similar to fire. So in fire, our immediate response, and Australia went through that process, saying encapsulation is the answer, because timber responds to actually fire. It's not the source of the fire, so it's a response mechanism, and will eventually start burning. Always depending on the fire load as well. If the fire load lasts long enough for then the structural timber to catch fire. Our response is kind of, again, encapsulation. A lot of people are still working on the possibility of treatment. But again, taking a bit of an insurer's point of view is, why is there a fire in the first place? So what is the root cause of the fire? And if we look into kind of, what's the most common cause of a fire is actually electrical issues. I call it short circuits, equipment, battery charges, some electrical equipment overheating. And that's circa 40% of the fire cases is in that space. So again, encapsulation protects the timber from responding, but there is still a dependency on the fire load in the structure, because even if you encapsulate, there is a reaction to high temperature over a certain period of time, even behind the encapsulation, which then again causes and creates more questions. So what's happening? Is there a jar behind the fire-ready plasterboard? How is that jar impacting actually the timber? Is there a smoldering happening suddenly, which hasn't been detected? And if you look recently, what kind of researchers have been finding, there is actually a heat transmission from the outside of the timber exposed to heat to the core of the timber over a long period of time. And that's an interesting observation. So you have got potential structural failures long after burnout.
Yeah.
So that, as an example, just gives you a bit of an idea of the work still required in that space. We're still learning.
Yeah. Well, it's still early. And I remember the first time I spoke to you about structural design, how do you do it? And you went to first principles, and you are doing it again with fire and moisture and things like that. It's like, when you get to a problem, finding what's the root, get underneath everything and get there. So it's a key pattern I've noticed potentially in your thinking to a lot of these things.
That's probably
Another
my
question of
German genetic.
I think it's
defect.
German. Yeah, I think you got the German style. I think and maybe the handcraft. Like you didn't mention your history of back in the cabinetry, but I think when you actually go down to that level and you're used to that and you scale up to the building level, maybe that's what comes with that. And you've been part of 100 projects, Karl-Heinz. So you mentioned some of the technical problems there. There might be some advice that you have for anyone else in this space on their projects, but that make them successful. So from your perspective, what are the keys to make a project successful?
First of all, you have to understand why do you want to build with timber. So you have to ask yourself the question. And then you kind of have to allow yourself to learn to a certain extent, and the learning can happen through all sorts of channels. Listening to your podcast as an example, or joining seminars. But I think at the same time is actually communicate. There is now here in Australia is an active call it community of practice. So people have gathered experience. So tap into that experience. And the other part is certainly kind of look at the project life cycle. So project life cycle is not only kind of isolated in the design. You have to look into design engineering, the whole process around the delivery, and understand as well kind of how are components manufactured, how they arrive on site, how they're going to be assembled, how it's timber potentially exposed to weather during that phase, and kind of taking a kind of, tend to say, a deep collaborative approach. In the industry, in the construction and build industry, and in the design industry, we kind of used to work more or less in isolation, and we see having to engage with a structural engineer as a necessity, and not as an opportunity to learn from each other. And that's actually vice versa as well. So I'm responsible for the architectural design, the expression of the building. I'm responsible for the numbers, and so the structure works, and I'm responsible for the delivery and assembly part. There is still too much silo behavior and too much demarcation. So what we have seen in the past is once you really embark on that kind of what I call the deep collaboration from day one, then actually projects can be very successful. And to my very unsurprised. I still hear people talking about early contractor engagement as being a key to success. If I go all the way back to my time at Karl-Heinz UK, we have done this without naming it as such. And you may call it a bit of naivety, because we went in and say, the architect expressed, "I want to do this in timber." When they didn't say, we're here to support you. And we kind of laid out everything on the table, where we are on our journey, where the architect is on the journey. We look together who's a good engineer to support, and are we actually all aligned on the objective? So Stadthaus Murray Grove is a good example, where the builder, the architect, the builder was the developer at the same time. The architect, the engineer, and back then Karl-Heinz UK Limited have been sitting at the table every single week in that design process, and we went through not only how we solved that structurally, what are the acoustic challenge, how can we kind of really get to that short delivery period. The Stadthaus Murray Grove, the structure was built in nine weeks. And there's always a funny story around the 9 weeks, because they had been put together by German carpenters, and the German carpenters had been flying in Sunday night, and they left Wednesday night, because the scaffolder had needed about 2.5 days to be another floor ahead of the install crew. So they came back, put another floor up, went back home. Still kind of, try to plan, we try to schedule, and we still, 2008, we had a lot of unknowns. So that building could have been installed in half the time. At the end, it was about 11 months from start on site to completion, and people moving in. I think people moving in, we are now mid-November, so I think people moved in beginning of December 2008. So that's about 15 years ago. So that was kind of, even from a builders and developers perspective, quite a success.
Yeah.
And I'm still saying we could have been much faster. And this is based on actually understanding, not only focusing on the timber structure driving program, but understanding actually it's how do you procure your windows? How much trust do you kind of have in your 3D model? And can you actually procure material way up front? Stadthaus Murray Grove, such a great example where the window supplier insisted on on-site measurement. And I said, you've got an Excel spreadsheet. The architect is underwriting that spreadsheet. You've got no risk. Other than you can say, the dimensions are given by, I'm happy to place the order. So that's kind of, looking into all the other parts coming with the structure. Same with the facade system. Everything can be procured way up front. So it's kind of, I've got a real assembly process actually on site. Again, if we look into recent projects, Lend-Lease had been building with International House, long waiting time for the facade to arrive. Big time lost there. 25 King Street was a great example where actually facade was, the building envelope was actually chasing the superstructure. So the facade was up actually just below the life deck. So, and I thought that's actually a great outcome. But there again, if we then look into how the services have been procured, was in a very traditional way, and even the services supplier had been saying, if we would have known that this goes that quickly, we would have taken a different approach to services.
Yeah.
So there is still a lot to kind of learn, but that means you look across, or you look into every interface between the different disciplines and different trades. It's probably more intense for the whole project team, but it's so rewarding because you
100%.
see how things go together faster, and how you have to struggle less with waterproofing. Again, on the T3 Collingwood project, a great example as a project, but water management during construction, really hard.
Yeah.
Really hard.
Same challenge that keeps popping up on a lot of projects. It's always on this podcast. So you've had, 15 years ago was Murray Groves Tap House, and where do you see things going in the next 10 to 15 years? I know this might be top of mind, but what are the sort of mega trends, and where do you see this industry growing to, and what does it look like going forward?
Oh, good question, Adam. And that's just looking around if I've got my crystal ball somewhere close. But there is a huge uncertainty at the moment, because we've got a geopolitical situation which is getting more and more tense every single day. So that's one thing which makes that kind of prediction hard. At the same time, I see, and regardless where I look, as kind of, the Financial Review, the newspapers, LinkedIn, etc., you see more and more companies stepping up and saying we need an ESG manager, which is a big shift to just in the last 2 years, because 2 years ago nobody was talking about ESG requirements. Now all the European suppliers, even here in Australia, businesses taking the ESG compliance requirements very serious, and I think that's where one of the biggest change drivers sit, is actually in the incentive which sits behind the ESG compliance. And in very simple terms, means it's a requirement coming through the investment world, and if you're ESG compliant, you get access to cheaper money. Really very simple terms. And ESG, kind of environmental, social, and governance, and that's where I think the biggest driver is gonna be. We see already decarbonization of construction industry as a direct response to ESG. So why are big companies setting their carbon targets, saying by 2025 we're going to be net zero, by 2040 we're going to be absolute zero? Because they understand the kind of the investment incentive big time, and that's probably one of the big drivers. That's why you see the Atlassian building coming together, where you see even the C6 in Perth has got this strong environmental aspect. People appreciate and want to live in a more sustainable way. People are more carbon conscious, and they're happy to even pay more to a certain extent for that. And that's why we have to look very closely, because again, it will be a question of resource availability and how we kind of satisfy this rapid growing demand in that space. obviously governments and local communities changing their strategies. There's the other aspect, obviously, circularity. It kind of sits even within these ESG requirements, even to a point where saying natural resources are proven and available. Full stop. There's no more discussion in that space. And circularity is an expectation. So it will be very interesting how the industry as such can respond to these changes, not only from a resource perspective, but from a probably procurement approach, from a design approach, from a collaboration approach, from a kind of thinking in a circular context. And what I'm seeing at the moment makes me a bit smile, because we think immediately, oh yeah, well, if we're going to have a timber building, it's all going to screw together, and we can unscrew and take it apart and reuse. I think that the bigger opportunity is actually on the two aspects. One aspect, all new build should be built in a way so they can be repurposed. It's not about a disassembly perspective, it's about a repurpose. So you build once and you keep it for a long, long time. And you can repurpose. So without having to kind of take it entirely down. And that repurpose aspect is certainly something in the, what we typically say, in a brownfield or the existing housing stock or building stock. So how can the existing stock being repurposed in an interesting way? I think there's a big opportunity there. And then obviously another big opportunity in the market at the moment is solving the housing crisis in the country, which turns into a bit of a race in a way, who has got the best solution. And sometimes I wish the industry would just pause and think in a very similar fashion, as I said before. If you're in a hurry, go slowly. Because we want to make sure that we are able to deliver on what we start to promise, and we understand actually what are we delivering.
Yeah, well, there's a lot in that. Well, it's been a phenomenal conversation, Karl-Heinz. It's been so good to get to speak to you for a second time. If people want to find out more about yourself, what you're up to these days, and if they can get in touch to potentially work with you, where should they go?
Just check out my LinkedIn profile, Weiss Insights, or go to weissinsights.com, my homepage.